Well, welcome everyone. My name is Missy Ryan. I'm a national security reporter with the Washington Post, and I'm really pleased to be here today with a great group of panelists for an important topic, the EU as a security actor beyond its neighborhood. First, I'd like to introduce the panelists here. We have Major General Cyril Carcy, Defense Attaché at the French Embassy here in Washington. We have Karlin, Assistant Secretary of Defense for Strategy, Plans, and Capability. And we have Lieutenant General Giovanni Manione, Deputy Director of the EU Military Staff for the European External Action Service. So we have a lot of topics to cover today, but I want to start today with Giovanni. If he can give us just a really quick 2 or 3 sentence summary of what exactly is the EU's role when it comes to security beyond the European continent, and just to start the conversation with a little bit of background here.
Thank you very much, Mr. 2 sentences, very difficult. Everybody knows what NATO does, or everybody think they know what NATO does. We discussed briefly before. So what European Union is supposed to do, very simple, is supposed to do everything NATO cannot or would not do in the field of security outside Europe. Complementarity is a word that is misused very often, but when I ask people what is the apportionment of the angles to make a complementary 360 degree, nobody can answer. Now, I will give you a hint on this. If you take defense, we defined defense before, that is NATO. If you take security, and we defined security before, this is European Union. It's a huge task. It goes from crisis prevention, also through capability in the sense of security capability building up in friendly countries, till crisis management when the previous one fails. Very simple in words, very complicated in making this happening.
All right.
2 sentences and a half.
Very good. Thank you, Giovanni. I want to delve into the conversation, into the substance of the topic today, starting by asking each panelist what is a big picture question that I think really gets to the heart of the conversation at this moment of dramatic transformation for Europe, and that is, how is the Ukraine crisis changing how EU countries and their US partner are thinking about defense posture and investments in Europe and beyond? How do you see the war changing prioritization of security issues for Europe, especially when it comes to the extracontinental sphere? And we're going to start with you, Cyril.
Thank you, Missy. First of all, I would like to highlight that I'm in a very specific or singular position today because I'm a French officer, but I will be able also to express my view on EU matters because France has the presidency of the EU Council until the end of the month. So, Giovanni, I'm going to speak about your business a little bit, and I'm sure it's going to be helpful to announce your own messaging. Regarding your question, I would like to raise 3 points. The first one is that intelligence has been and remains a key driver in this war. As a military, my first and foremost concern is to read my enemy. And before the invasion, NATO and EU have monitored with care the gathering of Russian troops at the border with Ukraine. And this military intelligence picture has been built by NATO, both NATO and EU members in focus collection activities. So intel sharing between EU, US, and NATO at that time has been key to get the best picture and to anticipate the crisis. So this anticipation has been crucial to prepare and then implement the sanctions against Russia. My second point deals with the strategic grammar, which has been overlooked for 25 years. an important part of this strategic grammar is nuclear deterrence language, which has not been really practiced since the 90s. So I think that we need to enhance the dialogue between EU and US in this field in order to underline our cohesion, but as well to avoid any escalation or misunderstanding. And by the way, this coordinated approach matches perfectly with the Pentagon integrated deterrence, which, from I understand, is a way to synchronize plans and action. And the third point I want to raise is that the Ukrainian war highlights the importance of winning the battle of the communication. This struggle involves not only strategic communication, but as well countering disinformation. That's it.
All right, thank you, Cyril. Giovanni, can you tell us from your perspective, how do you see the war changing the prioritization of security issues in Europe?
That one of the worst effects this war had on the Western side, in my view, is that it focused attention of the European member states on the Eastern Front, lowering the already low level of attention on the South. And it is a tragic effect. It is a huge mistake, because that means we are keeping resources stick to just in case something happens, forgetting completely that action should be taken now on another theater, as if we had a surgical team waiting for a major emergency, and the main surgeon would refuse even to have a look to somebody next door who cut his finger, letting him bleeding to death because they are waiting for the major case to happen. And I fear that this is a terrible effect of that war. Unbalancing completely the attention, focusing all the attentions on a single spot. And as I said just before, I'm not sure that is the main target of the Russian. Well, the main target of the Russian could be having people focused on there, forgetting their actions elsewhere. And there are many actions of the Russians elsewhere.
I'm glad that you raised some of the trade-offs in thinking about the Eastern Front, and that's something I hope we can delve into a little bit later. But first, Mara, tell us from a U.S. government, from the Pentagon perspective, how do you see the war in Ukraine changing how Europe should think about its defense posture and investments, and how it prioritizes things like Eastern Europe versus the South?
Thank you so much, Missy, and thanks for having me with such an extraordinary group. And look, I know this crowd, of course, knows this well, but the whole reason we're having this conversation is, of course, due to the irresponsible, aggressive actions of President Putin, who's trying to undermine each day peace and stability in Europe. You know, in looking at how this crisis has played out, I actually think my French colleague put it so well. In terms of the information sharing, it has been extraordinary. I think I would say it's unprecedented. And frankly, for any of us who remember quite well the 2014 Crimea crisis, it feels very different in terms of just how early, months and months before the crisis actually occurred, European allies and partners in the United States were really talking on a very consistent basis about how we thought the situation might come to fruition, how it might play out, and above all, what we would all do together. And I think that's what's really led to this just unprecedented show of unity, which it has really been extraordinary to see. I mean, the fact that you have 40+ countries supporting Ukraine is extraordinary, and it is, of course, indeed quite vital as well. So when we look at what this means in terms of kind of our approach from a Department of Defense perspective, I really appreciate our colleagues cited integrated deterrence, because that is very much the mantra of the Department of Defense in terms of our approach writ large to challenges these days. And what that really means is, how are we knitting together inside the Department of Defense? How are we doing so across our whole of government? And how are we doing so with our allies and partners? So in this crisis, for example, how do we make sure the Department of Defense is putting a combat credible force in NATO territory, which we have absolutely seen happen and seen happen pretty quickly, while also supporting Ukraine with the capabilities that it needs to defend itself? And how are we doing that, of course, across our interagency and, again, with our closest allies and partners? And as we are doing that, of course, we're thinking hard about what effect are we having? Are we actually achieving the ends that we are trying to do so? And of course, what are the trade-offs and what do those look like?
Great. Yeah. Well, I want to ask you a little bit more about the combat credible force that you're talking about going to Europe in a minute ahead of the NATO summit. But I'm going to go back to you, Cyril, and ask a little bit more about what European countries are doing outside of Europe. We know that many European countries are expected to increase their defense budgets in light of the threat from Russia and what's happening in Ukraine. But presumably much, if not all of this, will be directed towards the Eastern Front and the Russian threat. How do you see this altering the sort of extracontinental missions that European countries are doing, either through the EU and their training, or the things like what France is doing in the Sahel? I'm interested to hear how you think European countries should be thinking about the terrorism threat and what that should mean for a European presence in areas where this has been problematic. Certainly the threat does seem to have diminished, but is not eradicated.
Sure. As you may know, I was the deputy of Barkhane operation, so the name of the operation in the Sahel is Barkhane before coming here, before being positioned here. In this area, in this region, because it's a large one with 5 different countries, we are fighting against terrorism with at least 4,000 people, and 800 of them are from European countries. They are all special forces, and their mission is to train the Malian army in order to be able to gain a fighting spirit and to be much more involved against terrorism in an autonomous mission. So this mission will be ending at the end of the August, so at the end of this summer, because we are leaving Mali. But even if we are leaving Mali, we do expect to stay in the region in order to fight against terrorism from another position, which will be probably Niger, so much more in the south. Mm-hmm. And we want to keep what we call the Takuba spirit. Takuba is the name of this operation composed of European special forces. So we are dealing with that, and I can tell you that I was at the beginning of the build-up of this force, mm-hmm. and it's an incredible involvement of European Union in its neighborhood.
Do you think it makes do you think the urgency of the threat from Russia, and obviously the perception that Russia could at a certain point become emboldened to strike out at NATO nations, does it make it harder to for European countries to have increase their burden sharing with from the United States in some of the areas where, at a certain point in recent years, the United States had hoped to shift out of Africa or diminish its footprint in Africa? How does that affect that whole picture?
Well, it's already the case also in the Levant, in the Middle East. In Syria, we're also involved with the US, but it's much more, regarding Syria, EU, US, UK mission, and if we add the European Union involvement, is much more in Gulf of Aden with EMASO mission, which is a security mission in the Gulf of in the Gulf of Aden in the Levant. But I guess Giovanni can speak much more about it than mine.
Giovanni, is there anything you wanted to add on that, or?
Our big problem is that nobody knows what European Union does in the field of military in the field of the military. It just mentioned the Gulf of Aden. I could mention the coordinated maritime presence that is in Gulf of Guinea. We just launched another branch of the coordinated maritime presence in the Indian Ocean. That are activities performed by member states' naval units that coordinates through the European Union with a very light system of coordination, sharing information with the coastal countries as well, creating a high level of awareness. That would be very useful. It is very useful against the pirates, against the terrorists. Just to make you an example, the number of piracy attack in the Gulf of Guinea went down by 50% in the last year. I would not say because of, but also thanks to the coordinated maritime presence launched by the European Union.
That's great.
So what I'm talking about is low costly, high effective activities.
Thanks, Giovanni. Mara, going back to you, I know that we're going to hear more about this at the NATO summit next week in Madrid, but can you tell us a little bit more about how the US government or the Pentagon sees the war in Ukraine altering the transatlantic security partnership beyond Europe, and to what extent, sort of stepping back, does the war and everything that has come along with it, you mentioned, supplying Ukraine and then increasing American forces in Europe. To what extent does the war and the threat from Russia make it harder to deliver on other priorities, like the investment in the Asia Pacific, or making sure that counterterrorism doesn't become a bigger problem again?
Yeah, absolutely. Those are some really good points, Missy. Look, in terms of the partnership, I think you have seen the partnership grow in some pretty meaningful ways as we have all been dealing kind of with this threat. Just to speak quite specifically about the European Union, the Biden administration has really made an effort to increase its involvement, its cooperation with the European Union, and I would say the Department of Defense specifically has tried to do that as well as something that we see quite complementary, and I think we've seen the fruits of that in the areas we've cooperated in, military mobility just being one really good case study. And again, as I noted earlier, I mean, we have seen kind of unprecedented unity in the face of this horrific crisis, and that is quite meaningful. And now in terms of your next question, how hard is it then for us to deal with the other balls that we are all juggling? Look, I think our collaboration with our closest allies and partners is crucial for dealing with any of the challenges. And as you've probably seen in the fact sheet that the Department of Defense put out on the National Defense Strategy about a couple months or so ago, for the Department of Defense, the pacing challenge really is the PRC, and we see Russia as an acute threat. And of course, we have to continue to worry about other challenges. You named violent extremists as just one case study, which is a great example, I think, of the terrific cooperation, as you had noted earlier. And so it really becomes an issue of understanding the trade-offs and understanding the risks. I mean, I have to say, what I have seen with the response so far to the current crisis, whether it's how the Department of Defense has been able to surge forces to Europe, and we already, we started with about 80,000 forces there before the conflict began, and much of that was thanks to the great support of Congress, starting from about 2014 onward. But another 20,000 were surge, and that all worked very smoothly. We were able to get capable folks in very quickly, move them around Europe, but it wasn't just a story of the United States. It was also a story of our European allies and partners, and I think that is an extraordinary force multiplier and an extraordinary deterrent as well.
So just to follow up, so you don't see the potential for the war in Ukraine constraining I don't want to call it the pivot, but the shift to focus on the Asia Pacific. You don't see that happening?
I think as those issues come to fruition, right, as the concerns arise, it is incumbent on all of us to step back and try to understand if there's going to be some sort of clash and how to think hard about it, whether it's terms of readiness concerns, for example, or investments. But I think what you saw in the president's budget that went forward not long ago was really an emphasis on dealing with that pacing challenge that is the PRC, and then dealing with that acute threat posed by Russia. So I guess what I would say is we have to be eyes wide open as we work on bringing this effort to fruition. And as, of course, we're living in a very dynamic security environment.
Right.
And it is one where, while we have this profound unity and this profound collaboration, we've really got to kind of have our ears to the ground as we try to feel out, as you know, just how things are changing.
Well, I definitely want to get back to China, and if we can, before we open up to questions, and the potential for U.S. and EU interest to diverge or not to be entirely overlapping when it comes to China. But first I wanted to go back to you, Giovanni. When we were in the green room, we were speaking about Libya. And I'm wondering if you could talk to us a little bit about how you think the United States and Europe can better collaborate to counter Russian adventurism. Obviously in Europe we've seen malign activities by Russia, but specifically in places like Libya, other parts of Africa, Syria. How can the United States, how can the EU and the US better bring their capabilities and resources to bear to counter that?
That I don't say thank you for the question, because it is overused answers. Do you know how many times we meet with our colleagues of AFRICOM that happily happens to be based in Stuttgart, which is a very short distance from Brussels? So we do exchange visits at every level: Director General, Commander, myself, Deputy Commanders and Chief of Staff, and our intelligence are talking with each other weekly. We even have a liaison officer. That just to make you understand which is the level of cooperation that there is between the EU military staff and AFRICOM in particular. We share the same view on Africa. We share the same intelligence. Unfortunately, neither of us has the means needed to intervene in the proper way. So this is for you. This is a message for you.
Yeah.
But yes, I think that we are cooperating quite a lot. If you take Somalia, for example, where the US is going to reinvest a certain amount of effort, and where the European Union, especially through the Italian contingent, is investing a lot, we are doing things. Unfortunately, we are talking about a huge continent with an incredible number of different realities that needs to be taken care of. And I think that European Union might have a huge role in this. Of course, if the US cooperate with the European Union bilaterally, then the result might be maximized, no doubt on that. And need to be done. Libya is an example. Libya is an example for, first of all, on where NATO would never, ever go. NATO would never, ever go in Libya. And this is the reason why there is a need for a regional actor to do things like crisis management in Libya or similarly, and this is the European Union. And I think that when the US will clearly realize this, and we will clearly talk with each other bilaterally, leaving NATO aside, because it has nothing to do, it is not within the remits of NATO competencies, then things will go much better.
Can you just clarify for the audience why you think that NATO would never go to Libya, for example, given the history of of 2011. I'm just wondering if you could tell the audience why you think that.
But because NATO to act outside its own area of responsibility needs consensus. The automatism forecasted by Article 5, it is in case of an aggression of one of the allies, is not to preserve the overall interest or because we do think that it would be nice or useful to do something. And certainly, consensus will never be reached if we talk about Libya. Because some of the allies will never, ever allow this. And this is a reality.
Would you want to jump in? Please,
yes,
go ahead.
I would like to
Yeah.
jump in because it's the same in the Sahel. NATO will never be involved in the Sahel, and today we've got and I didn't mention that, but it's really important. We've got a great success story with both EU, France, which has leadership of this operation, but as well the US, which is providing every single day key enablers such as ISR, transport aircraft, and even air refueling for our assets. So it's really a success story, and we are trying to going on with that operation. And coming back to the Indo-Pacific question about the burden sharing, I just want to mention that France is a country of Indo-Pacific. So we do send, we have some military assets in this region, and we do send some high-level assets such as frigates, submarine in the region in order to train with the US and to remind everybody that the freedom of navigation is really an important fact for us. Last year we did send a submarine, a frigate, but as well some fighters, French fighters who landed in Hawaii Island and trained with the US. So in the Pacific.
Is there anything you want to add to that?
No, I just really appreciate some of these points. I mean, the EU and NATO are distinct entities with distinct sets of tools in their toolbox, and to the extent that those can be used in a complementary fashion rather than duplicative, I think that meets all of our interests. I really appreciate my colleagues sort of diving into these specific areas where I think we've seen some really meaningful cooperation, the Sahel, the relationship with AFRICOM, but in particular, I also appreciate my French colleague just highlighting that our European allies have some very strong interests in and involvement with the Indo-Pacific as well. I think it's not always as natural for folks to recognize, but it is quite profound.
Thank you. Thanks, Mara. So I'm going to try to get in another question or two before we open it up to the audience. And this is really for anyone here who wants to jump in. And I'd like to ask the panelists, as the United States pivots or tries to shift towards the Asia-Pacific to focus on China's rise, how should the EU think about balancing its important partnership with the United States with its own security and economic concerns? The U.S. relationship with China is not exactly the same as the European relationship, and there are some issues, including certain, technology and telecoms issues that are different. How do you see that as a potential for problematic divergence, or is this something that can be managed, especially, at a moment of stress given the war in Ukraine?
From my perspective, I think that the great competition does not only take place in Indo-Pacific. The EU, both the EU and France, have also interest in Middle East and Africa. So we can defend and care about this region and act to contain these competitors who are present in Africa and the Middle East. So it's not only the involvement of France or the EU in Indo-Pacific is also a way to contain Greek competitors outside this very focused region, which is Indo-Pacific for the US.
Giovanni or Mara, do you want to add?
It is clear that the main focus or the main effort of EU and the main effort of US are divided into different geographic areas. mostly. So they do not disappear completely in the other one, but they are reduced. It is important that to cover the security of the whole European Union and the US are complementary in geographic footprint. So it is clear that we cannot have a strong presence in the Indo-Pacific area as a union, which instead the United States can, and vice versa. More for a matter of resources, it is clear that the European Union must cover all the southern part of our hemisphere and US assisting. So this being the supported and being the supporting, it must be reciprocal. And I think that the sooner this becomes clear and the sooner the two huge entities, we are talking about 311 million on one side, 500 million on the other side, with a huge economic power, both. When we will understand that we need to share our responsibilities in these two areas and cooperate respectively, then it will be a great success. And then there will be no Russian around. China, we will think about, but Russia will be no match for such an alliance.
Mara, do you want to add anything?
I don't have anything to add.
So, it is a big challenge, Giovanni. I just came last week from covering the Summit of the Americas in Los Angeles, and there was a lot of talk of China's inroads in Latin America, and Latin America obviously has been an area of historic, power projection for the United States, and even there, the United States itself is being challenged. So I think for the EU, you're talking about EU's influence in the global South, in an era where there are not unlimited budgets and there are these other compelling challenges. It's not a given, I think, for sure. So I'm going to open it up to the audience if we have any questions. I see a gentleman here in the front row. Just Sarah. Yep, thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm a student with the Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies. I have a question specifically for Dr. Karlin. So my question is largely related to the administration's pivot to the Indo-Pacific strategy and how the Defense Department is preparing for its capacity to address two simultaneous challenges. So as you know, on top of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, it could inspire a potential a sooner invasion of Taiwan by the Chinese military. So what specific measures, if Dr. Karlin can elaborate on how the Defense Department is preparing its readiness to address two simultaneous challenges at the same time. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much. It's always nice to get a hard question from a Sci student, as a former Sci student. I appreciate that. Look, the Defense Department is working obviously very closely with Taiwan as it looks at what it is procuring, as it looks at how and in what ways it is making reforms of its military, and how it thinks about contingencies. And as you can imagine, every day we spend a lot of time in the Pentagon thinking hard about contingencies and ensuring that we have the resources to execute them should any of them arise. So I would say there's a lot of effort being put to that. You have kind of probably seen us speaking a little bit about our need, as put in the National Defense Strategy fact sheet, to be able to deter conflict and, if necessary, prevail. And so I would say when you look across the Department of Defense and you look at the president's budget that was put out not long ago, I mean, that is all really focused on ensuring that that if the president has a concern that the Defense Department needs to have the capabilities to deal with, that can be the case.
All right, do we have any other questions from the audience? I think there's one over here in the front row.
Thank you very much.
Can you identify yourself? Yeah, thanks.
Sure. Just realized that. A graduate student at the University of North Carolina. A question that has been dawning on me throughout this discussion just now is the fact that in the summer months of 2019, we of course saw a very groundbreaking series of events in which the sitting president had pursued an extortion of President Zelensky to provide compelling information on a political opponent, and did so through withholding very serious military aid for the country. Now, Ukraine is in an extremely vulnerable position. So we currently, of course, have a different regime in power here with President Biden, who is continuing to, him and his administration, provide aid to Ukraine. We also see Germany has just committed an unprecedented amount of money as well in their defense budget. My question, Ms. Karlin or the other panelists, is what can we realistically and should realistically see from the United States to secure prosperity for Ukraine that can be, not talked about now, talk about in the long run, because these varying presidential administrations in this country can differ so astronomically. What should we expect to see from the United States in the long run to have lasting peace for Ukraine and eventually Ukrainian membership in the EU?
Well, I know you all heard from Deputy Secretary Sherman earlier today, and I'm sure she, being from the State Department, would do a much better job than I could, giving you the whole outline of how the United States is trying to ensure that there is a democratic, independent, sovereign, and prosperous Ukraine that can deter and defend itself against further aggression. I can tell you from a Department of Defense perspective, we're spending a lot of time in particular on that last piece of ensuring that you have a Ukraine that is able to deter and defend itself. And we've seen that, from the start of the Biden administration, there's been about $6 billion or so in assistance that has gone to Ukraine. And obviously we have seen that just going so incredibly fast, frankly, a heck of a lot faster than I might have ever comprehended our system moving, where effectively decisions are made and days later material is arriving to be used by the Ukrainian forces. But what I would note is it's actually a little bit of a longer story, and I would trace this story actually back to about 2014, where following the Crimea invasion, the Congress here pushed really hard for the Ukraine Security Assistance Initiative, which unlike what is not always the approach to security cooperation, what the Ukraine Security Assistance Initiative did that was so important is it was really holistic, and it talked about training, equipping, reform, really helping Ukraine's military get into the position institutionally where, should you be in a crisis, as we're seeing now, it's actually able to take in tons and tons of assistance very quickly, get the training if it doesn't have it, and then use that immediately on the battlefield. And that has been pretty extraordinary. So from a Defense Department perspective, I would say that's what, at least on your question, that's the part that we're really zeroing in on. And I think we are really doing so in, again, ways that have, frankly, just boggled the mind in terms of the speed and the scale.
All right, I think we may have time for one very, very quick question. I think I saw a gentleman with his hand up over there. And you're just going to have to ask it really quickly, and we're going to have a quick answer because we've got the clock counting down here.
Sure. My name is Davis. I'm a recent graduate and former president of the Harvard International Relations Council. I'll keep it brief, but I just wanted to ask very specifically, we've been talking about the ways that the defense priorities have aligned quite nicely between the EU, US, and NATO recently, but what, in the view of each of you, are the main points of potential tension and disagreement in that relationship in the future? What are the things that concern you?
Great question. Who wants to take that?
Concern? We have no concern.
Well, that's a pity.
What I do think, we have no concern. I mean, I do think that the language is important, words are important, and the meaning of words are fundamental. We should start from making clarity to this between us. When I talk with my American friends and colleagues, they use the word NATO some 58 times per minute. That astonished me very much. And then also Europeans do the same. Instead of using US and EU. NATO is not a political union. The US is a political state, by the way, a federal state made of different states, and the European Union is a political union. Two political entities needs to talk with each other on matter of security and defense. Then we will have no concern. NATO is a practicality with a simple task and automatic reaction to simple input. One is attacked, everybody react. It doesn't take decision, political. States take decisions.
We are out of time, but Mara, Cyril, do either of you want to jump in for a very last sentence or word?
Sure, I would just quickly say we need to be communicating as frankly as possible. We need to be increasing our collaboration, which I think is very much happening, and we need to ensure that we're taking a complementary approach.
And just dialogue, right? It started at the end of last year, and I hope it's going on between EU and US, right? Dialogue.
Okay, well, I wish we had more time to keep the conversation going, but Cyril, Giovanni, and Mara, thank you so much for being here today, and thank you to the Atlantic Council for having us, and thanks to our audience for being here.